All right, so today we're diving deep into something I know a lot of you have been wanting us to cover, and that's safety in Jamaica. You know, when you think about Jamaica, you probably picture like those amazing beaches, that turquoise water, the vibrant culture, the music. But like any travel destination, there's always more to the story. And honestly, some of what we found while researching this deep dive was a little, well, intense. So I'm really glad we have you here to help us break it all down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting about Jamaica is that it's often categorized as like a medium risk destination. But what does that really mean, right? In practice, it kind of puts it in this middle ground between the safety level of, let's say, the US and somewhere like Mexico. So it's not like a complete no-go zone, but it does mean you need to be a bit more aware of your surroundings than you might be on a trip back home.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can't just assume it's all, sunshine and reggae music.
hmm
So what are the main things that travelers should be watching out for?
Well, the two big ones are natural disasters, especially hurricanes, which, are a risk during that June to November season.
Mm.
And then, unfortunately, there's violent crime, which is something we definitely need to talk about. But the important thing to remember is that it's mostly concentrated in certain urban areas.
Okay, so it's like this tale of two Jamaicas. You've got these idyllic vacation spots, but then these other areas that are much riskier.
Yeah, exactly. And I know the crime statistics can be a bit alarming when you first see them. Jamaica actually has one of the highest murder rates in the world. But here's a key thing to keep in mind. It's largely driven by gang activity, and a lot of it's confined to very specific neighborhoods. Tourists are actually rarely the targets in these incidents.
That's a really crucial point. I think it's easy to see those headlines about crime in Jamaica and think that, the whole island is dangerous.
Right.
But it sounds like it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like any big city, right? There are certain areas you just know to avoid. Same idea applies here.
But even if tourists aren't usually the targets in those really high crime areas, it still seems like something to be aware of.
So, what about those tourist areas, those places where most people are going to be visiting? Are there specific risks there that we should be talking about?
Yeah, even in those tourist spots, it's still smart to be cautious. Petty theft can happen, things like pickpocketing. And actually, the U.S. State Department has issued warnings about sexual assaults,
Yeah.
which can even occur in resorts, unfortunately.
Wow, that's unsettling. It's a good reminder that no place is completely risk-free, I guess, even those places that look like paradise.
Exactly.
And then, of course, you've got those hurricanes to think about. We saw that just recently with Hurricane Beryl this past July.
Oh, yeah. That was a close one.
It almost made a direct hit.
Yeah,
It's a good reminder that if you're traveling during hurricane season, you really need to stay informed. Check those forecasts and have a plan, just in case.
absolutely.
So it's like, enjoy those beaches, soak that Jamaican sun, but don't forget to bring your common sense with you.
Okay, so we've talked about those natural disasters and the crime situation. But what about the Jamaican government? Are they doing anything to try and improve safety, particularly for visitors?
Yeah, they are definitely making efforts. You'll see things like mobile police patrols, especially around tourist zones. And there are specialized tourist police units as well. But, there are some pretty deep-rooted challenges that they're up against.
Yeah, I can imagine it's not an easy fix. What kind of challenges are we talking about specifically?
Well, things like police corruption, lack of resources, inadequate equipment. These are issues that plague a lot of Caribbean and Latin American nations. They're working on it, but it's a slow process.
So it's kind of a mixed bag, right? Beautiful island, incredibly welcoming people, but then these underlying safety concerns that you just can't ignore.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And what's really interesting is how the safety situation can vary so dramatically,
Hmm.
depending on where you are in Jamaica.
Okay, yeah. So let's break that down a little bit. You've been digging into the details about the different regions. Can you give us a sense of where things stand?
Well, you've got this really stark contrast between those private resorts,
Yep.
which are generally considered very safe. They have their own security measures in place. And then those urban centers where, as we were saying, the risks are just much higher.
Right, so those resorts are almost like little bubbles, kind of a world apart from the rest of the island.
Yeah, in a way.
But let's get specific here. Are there any places that our listeners should absolutely avoid?
Well, both Global Guardian and the U.S. State Department have issued some pretty clear warnings, especially when it comes to certain areas within Kingston, the capital. We're talking about neighborhoods like Mountain View, Trenchtown, Tivoli Gardens. These are places that are known for gang activity, places where even locals are very cautious.
So those are definite no-go zones, even during the day.
Yeah, it's best to just avoid them altogether. And even in safer parts of Kingston, like the historic areas, petty crime can still be an issue. Things like street robberies and pickpocketing.
Got it. So be extra careful, even in those areas that seem relatively safe. Now, what about Montego Bay? I know a lot of people go there on vacation. Is that considered generally safe?
Well, Montego Bay is a bit trickier. The resorts and tourist areas right on the coast are usually fine, but the U.S. State Department specifically warns about venturing inland, away from the A1 highway in Queens Drive.
So it's like you can picture yourself on that beautiful coastline. Everything seems okay. But as soon as you head inland, the risks start to increase.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
It's interesting how geography plays such a big role in all of this.
It really does. And then there's one place that the U.S. State Department actually advises against traveling to altogether, regardless of whether you're staying at a resort or not. And that's Clarendon Parish. It's known for high levels of violence, a lot of it gang-related.
Okay, Clarendon Parish, got it. Added to the mental avoid list. So we've got those rough areas of Kingston, inland Montego Bay, and all of Clarendon Parish to be extra cautious about. What about the overall travel advisory for Jamaica? Where does that stand right now?
As of July 2024, the U.S. State Department has Jamaica at a level 3 travel advisory, which means reconsider travel. It's based on the overall crime situation.
Level 3, okay. That's definitely something that would give me pause if I was planning a trip. And I'm guessing within Jamaica, some areas probably have even higher advisories.
Yeah, you're right. Some parishes or specific spots within them are actually at level 4, which is do not travel. That means they're considered extremely dangerous, even for U.S. Embassy personnel.
Okay, wow. This is a lot to take in. I'm sure our listener is processing all this information about the different risk levels, those areas to avoid. But before we jump into the practical tips for staying safe, let's take a quick pause here. We'll be right back with more on Jamaica after a short break. Okay, so we're back, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners are thinking like, all right, so Jamaica has its risks, but is it even worth it? Is it worth the potential danger?
That's a really good question, and it boils down to like personal risk tolerance, right? How much are you willing to kind of trade off for that incredible Caribbean experience that you're going to get in Jamaica?
Yeah, because let's be honest, Jamaica has this magnetic pull. You've got those
Right.
beaches, the music, the food. It's so captivating. But then you factor in those crime stats, it's hard to just ignore.
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure. And I think
Okay.
it's important to remember that, perception and reality don't always line up perfectly. Sometimes what we see in the news or even in those like official reports can create a sense of danger that might not reflect the average tourist experience at all.
That's true. You could read every single warning imaginable, be like, oh my gosh, I am never going to Jamaica. It sounds terrifying. But then you talk to someone who just got back from like an amazing trip to Jamaica, they're like, it was paradise. I felt totally safe the whole time.
Exactly. And that's where like figuring out your own risk tolerance comes in. Some people are just naturally more comfortable with traveling to places that others might not even consider. It's about knowing yourself and what you're comfortable with.
Okay, so how do you even begin to figure that out? Is it like a gut feeling or is there like a more logical approach?
It's kind of both, right? Part of it's just intuitive. Like, how do you generally feel about uncertainty, about being outside your comfort zone? But you can also be rational about it too. You can look at the data, weigh the probabilities, and make a decision that feels informed based on your specific circumstances.
All right, so let's say our listener is leaning towards caution, but they still really want to experience Jamaica. What are some concrete steps that they can take to really minimize that risk?
Well, first, I would say choose your destination wisely. We've talked about those higher risk areas, so maybe for a first trip, focus on regions that are known for being safer, like well-established tourist zones, particularly those all-inclusive resorts
Yeah.
with robust security.
Those resorts are kind of like their own little world, right?
Yeah.
With that like controlled access and all the security personnel.
Yeah, pretty much. It really minimizes the need to even venture outside, which can be a huge plus for some travelers, especially those who prioritize safety and peace of mind.
But what about those travelers who really want to experience like the real Jamaica, right? Like
Yeah.
beyond those resort walls. Is that even possible without taking on a ton of risk?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the allure of Jamaica is its culture, its people. So to really experience that authentic side, I would consider organized tours with reputable operators. They know those safe routes, have those local connections, and can provide a little bit of a buffer.
So you're kind of sacrificing a bit of spontaneity for a greater sense of security.
Yeah, exactly. And then there are those basic travel safety tips that apply, you know, tenfold in a place like Jamaica. Be aware of your surroundings, don't flash valuables, and just avoid putting yourself in those risky situations, like walking alone at night or in deserted areas, things like that.
Right. Common sense goes a long way.
And also, don't forget, most Jamaicans are incredibly warm and welcoming. Don't be afraid to engage with locals, ask for advice, get their perspective on safety. They know their communities best.
I love that. It's like having a built-in network of local experts.
Totally. And just a quick tip on language. English is widely spoken, obviously, but learning a few basic Jamaican patois phrases can be super helpful and shows respect for the local culture.
Oh, that's a great idea. I bet you could have some really cool interactions that way. Okay, now we have to talk about scams. Are there any specific scams that tourists should be aware of?
Oh, absolutely. Just like anywhere else in the world, there are people who are going to try and take advantage of tourists. One common one is the ganja tour scam, where they promise you this like amazing tour of a marijuana plantation, but it ends up being a total ripoff or worse. Stick to those reputable tour operators to avoid that one.
Oh, wow, that's sneaky. What about taxi scams? Are those common?
Yeah, for sure. Always agree on the price before you get in, preferably in Jamaican dollars. And make sure the taxi has a red license plate with PPV on it. That means they're licensed to pick up tourists.
Okay, red plates, PPV, negotiate the price up front. Got it. So let's say the worst happens and someone finds themselves in an emergency situation. Who do they contact?
The emergency number in Jamaica is 110 for the police, or 110 for an ambulance. And remember, the U.S. Embassy in Kingston can also provide assistance to American citizens.
Good to know. Okay, so we've talked about personal risk tolerance, those practical safety tips, and even emergency contacts. But I think we need to address the elephant in the room, that high murder rate that we talked about earlier. How do you reconcile that with, the desire to experience Jamaica?
It's definitely a valid concern. It's important to understand that the vast majority of that violence is concentrated in very specific areas, and it usually involves gangs. Tourists are very rarely the targets in those incidents.
So it's about being aware, but not letting fear, completely take over and ruin your whole trip.
Yeah, exactly. Informed decision-making is key. You weigh the risks, you take precautions, and you choose your adventures wisely.
But how do you strike that balance between being cautious and actually enjoying yourself? It's easy to get so wrapped up in worry that you miss out on all the beauty that Jamaica has to offer.
You're absolutely right. It's about finding that sweet spot where you're aware but not consumed by the potential dangers. And I think that's where research and preparation come in. The more you know, the more confident you'll feel navigating Jamaica safely.
I love that. Knowledge is your best defense. So what are some good resources that our listeners can use to do their own research before their trip?
Well, the U.S. State Department website is always a great starting point. They have really detailed travel advisories and safety tips specifically for Jamaica. Websites like Global Guardian also provide those like security assessments and travel risk management advice.
What about travel blogs and forums? Are those pretty reliable?
Yeah, those can be helpful too, but I would take them with a grain of salt. Look for consistent patterns, not just one person's isolated experience. And honestly, sometimes the best resource is just local knowledge. Reach out to your hotel, tour operators, or even locals that you might know who live in Jamaica. They can give you the most up-to-date and personalized advice.
That's such a good point. It's like having your own personal safety guide. So we've covered a lot of ground here. From personal risk tolerance to practical tips, scams, even those emergency contacts, I think our listeners are pretty well equipped now to start planning that safe and informed trip. But before we wrap up this part, I have a more philosophical question for you.
Oh, I do love a good philosophical question.
Do you think the media's portrayal of Jamaica, especially when it focuses so heavily on crime, do you think that contributes to this distorted perception of the country? And if so, what can be done to kind of change that narrative?
That's a complex one. I think it's about balancing the responsibility to report accurately on a country's challenges, but also showcasing, its beauty, its culture, its resilience. It's a tough line to walk.
It really is. And I think sensationalism, especially when it comes to crime, can paint a very one-sided picture.
Exactly. We tend to fixate on the negative and we forget that Jamaica is also a place of incredible warmth, creativity, and natural splendor. It's a country with such a rich history and a spirit that shines through, despite the challenges.
And those stories deserve to be told too, right? Those stories of hope, of community, of the everyday joys of life that exist alongside those harsher realities.
Absolutely. It's about finding that narrative that acknowledges the complexities, the
Mm.
nuances, that full spectrum of human experience that makes up Jamaica.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's a perfect segue to the final part of our deep dive. We've really gone deep on the safety concerns, the practical tips, even those philosophical questions surrounding travel to Jamaica. But in part three, we're going to hear directly from travelers who've experienced Jamaica firsthand. They're going to share their stories, their insights, and their perspectives on safety and risk.
I can't wait to hear those stories. It's one thing to talk about statistics and advisories,
Yeah,
but hearing from those who've actually lived and breathed that Jamaican experience, that's what really brings it all to life.
I completely agree. So join us for part three, where we're going to hear from those real travelers who've really explored the heart and soul of Jamaica. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking out those authentic experiences that make travel so rewarding.